Reactor online. Sensors online. Weapons online. All systems nominal.
Hey everyone, B1B Flyer here, and in this video I'm going to show you how to paint Clan Jade Falcon Elementals in their Iota Galaxy colors. For paints, I'll be using model color Ivory, game color Bonewhite, P3 Iosan Green, a silver, a red, and for washes I'm going to be using a dark tone, Algae, which you can substitute by mixing military shader and blue tone, which I will show you how to do, Glaze Medium, as well as a Quickshade wash mixing medium, which will help with the wash technique that we'll be using later. For the base, we'll just be using game color Desert Yellow, some Quickshade soft tone, and a khaki. Brushes, I'll be using a 0 Kolinsky Sable, a synthetic number 2, and a synthetic dry brush. I've started by priming my base white. I've also put the basing material on, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the base coat, I'll be using Iosan Green and some Ivory, and I'm going to mix them together because I'm trying to match the color of a previous paint scheme I've done using the airbrush and oils. However, I'm not going to waste that time on these elementals being so small, and it would be difficult to get the details and the blends at this scale. I'm looking to get a fairly light, almost minty green color because I'm going to wash it down with the algae wash later, and I know it's going to darken. Essentially, I'm trying to match the highlights of the Thor 2 that I painted previously, and I'll just be setting the darker shaded areas using the wash and skipping the mid-tone. Again, at this scale, you won't be able to tell. I apologize for the washout of the white on the camera. It will get better once the color is added to the miniature. Once you're happy with the shade that you have to base coat your miniatures, just simply apply it to the entire miniature and work your way around. The color I'm doing is for Iota Galaxy, which is an emerald green. However, this will work for several of the Jade Falcon units, as well as the Clan Wolf Alpha Galaxy if you adjust the shades of the paints that you start with. I'd still recommend you follow up with the wash ratios that I'm using later, and then the accent colors will simply be just whatever is appropriate for the unit you're painting. I did put the base texture on before I primed the base. I simply removed the 2 jumping elementals to allow me room to work, and then applied the texture basing, made a little bit of an opening for each of the pegs and re-glued them back on once I was done and finished it up. It allows for a lot easier access to work, and I didn't get any material on the legs or the smoke plumes from the jumping elementals while I did it. When you're happy with the base coat colors, let it dry and we'll move on. Now that the base coat's finished, I'm going to add some silver because it's another part of the accent colors of the scheme using my 0 brush. Got a little bit of the silver here. I'm going to pick out mostly the gun barrels and the weapons. It's just the easy way to add the silver accents on these miniatures and not have to try to follow lines or little tiny panels and things like that. I'm just going to put a little bit on each of the gun barrels, the vents at the back, and so on. Take your time with this. There's not a whole lot of actual painting to do, so it's to your benefit to slow down and make sure you get it right. But if you do make a mistake, you've still got your base coat color that you can just add right back, and you don't have to worry about fixing anything that was blended or highlighted or shaded. The other detail we're going to add during this early on step is going to be to add a visor color. I'm going to use a very bright red, knowing that it's going to get washed down a little bit, but what this is going to do is save me the hassle and frustration and potential mistakes of trying to do it at the very end of the paint scheme when I've already done all the other steps. Now the consequence to that is that it's going to be darker than when we started, and it's not going to show up as much, but on these figures it's such a small little spot. Even if you decide not to paint it, no one's going to notice, or you could even just put a little bit of extra wash or a shade in there and not worry about it. I just take my time. I've added a little bit of water to my red, and then once I'm done, I'm going to look at it and then touch up anything that I got a little bit out of the recesses with, just to fix the green and make sure it's not where it shouldn't be. As you can see from the photograph, we've got our base coat and our 2 colors of detail applied. The next step will be to add a wash. I really like Secret Weapon Miniatures Algae for this. It's a blue-green. However, if you don't have it, you could take a dark blue and a dark green, mix them in equal proportions, and you will get a very similar result. And it probably won't be enough to differ between the one that I'm using, so hopefully that'll work for you. The other element that really helps the wash process with this is using Army Painter's Quickshade mixing medium and a Glaze Medium. You could also substitute Flow Improver for this. Essentially what we're going to do is thin down the wash material and we're also going to help it just stay in the recesses and not shade the surface area too much. Again, at this scale, it'd be so tiny to try to keep it off of the surfaces. We know we're going to change the color of the overall miniature. We don't have any choice with that. I don't want to spend too long painting each one, and this is a nice shortcut, but also if you understand what it's going to do to the miniature, then you can prepare for it by having a brighter color beneath it. I mix everything in a 1:1:1 ratio, 1 drop of each medium equally for the mix. As I've got it on the paper towel, you can see it thins it down a little bit. It's not quite as dark. I like to use a water bottle cap to keep it from spilling, and also it's a nice way to just be done with it and not have to clean up anything else. You'll apply the wash fairly heavily. You want to make sure you get it in all the recesses and all the cracks, knowing that you're going to have to wick a lot of it away at the end, but you want to get those initial recesses and cracks all covered by the wash. You don't need a whole lot of paint on the brush since the figures are so small, but again, make sure that you see those recesses get filled by the wash material. You want a lot of darker contrast. It's going to mute out somewhat, but really we're looking to get those areas shaded so that they'll be prominent when we're done with the miniature. Because they're so small at the distance you'll be viewing them, it's going to get lost if you don't. Now, for those of you that have worked with Glaze Medium as well as Army Painter Quickshade, what we essentially did was make a contrast paint. This is going to take at least an hour to dry, but it's going to dry smooth, and it's going to stay in the recesses where we want it to, and it's going to bring out the edges of the raised surfaces very similar to what contrast paints would do. And you can look online for other ways to make a wash in this similar way, to make your own contrast paints, if you will. I'm not necessarily doing that because I'm trying to say, hey, use contrast paint. I'm just letting you know that this has very similar property to what contrast paint does have. However, it is a thinner mix than what contrast paint would be out of the bottle, so it's, I think, easier to work with and a little bit more forgiving. After you've got all of them coated, go in and you have to make sure to go and wick away the excess and touch up the areas where it pulled away. It's going to pool in the groin, between the legs. There's going to be pooling there. You have to take that out. If you don't, it's going to take forever to dry, and it's going to look really bad when it's done. Make sure you reinforce areas on the legs and then the leg joints. It likes to wash away a little bit, and then clean it up around the feet in case your base might be a different color than mine. Speaking of the bases, I'm going to use the base color Desert Yellow while I'm waiting for this wash to dry to maximize my time. I'm just going to take my synthetic number 2 and add a little water and make sure that I coat the entire base area, being as careful as I can. Of course, if it touches the model a little bit here and there, you can either touch it up or you can just leave it alone or work it out later, maybe covering it with flock or maybe some static grass tufts or something. This is a great way to maximize your hobby time, is to do steps that you can do while other steps are being done, especially for washes and things that take a while to dry. Now, of course, if you're painting 5 bases of these, you could just work in steps, get all that other stuff done and maximize your time. Another recommendation would be, is if you have limited hobby time, would be to do this wash towards the end of what you have available and then set it and leave it for the next day or the next time that you're able to work on them, and that'll guarantee that they'll be completely dry. Let that base coat dry. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes, and then grab some Army Painter Soft Tone or maybe a Seraphim Sepia if you like to use Citadel washes. I'm going to cover the entire base area with a coat of the wash here. I like to let some of it sit in certain recesses and pool up in areas to add a little bit of variety of depth with the intensity of the shade, but if you don't like that effect, you can obviously thin it out or wick some of it away, or you could even go heavier or darker. Choices for you, it's your base. Now let that wash as well as the base wash dry. Again, I like to let it go for at least an hour to make sure that I'm not going to upset or disrupt anything that isn't dry. Now it's time to grab some Bonewhite, and I'm going to add the accent colors. In addition to the silver, the Jade Falcon Iota Galaxy uses Bonewhite highlights, and the easiest places to pick on these elemental models are the thigh plates and shoulder pauldrons. Now you don't have to do all 4, but the nice thing about this is it's not the highly detailed missile launcher area, which is only on 4 out of the 5, and the shoulder pauldrons are easy to reach no matter what model you have. If you haven't repositioned them, they're all easy to get to, and there's not any contorting or weird brush angles you really have to worry about. Now the thigh plates are a little bit more difficult to reach, so if you want to skip those, that's fine. It's your model, it's completely up to you. The shoulder pauldrons are going to be what shows up the most, so I recommend that if you're going to add an accent color, that you probably put it there. I'm just using thinned Bonewhite, making sure I get nice even coverage on all the panels, getting up to the edge as close as I can. Not too concerned about going over the edge because we're going to use a wash over this as well. If you're doing Jade Falcon Delta and you're going to be putting yellow as your accent color, I recommend you follow this exact same process using a Bonewhite or an Ivory beneath it to save yourself a lot of hassle of trying to put yellow over green. Then put the yellow over the top of it and you'll have your yellow accents. With the Bonewhite colors completed, we're going to do a few more things here by adding a wash to the silver and metallic areas to help add some depth as well as take down some of the shininess. I've got Army Painter's dark tone, but you could use Nuln Oil or any other black wash that you prefer. I'm really just taking my detail brush and focusing on the small metallic areas that I want to have washed down essentially to a little bit more of a used and worn metal look. I still feel this meets the intent of the silver accents of the miniature scheme, but also at the same time it's a very simple way to add some variation as well as a bit of realism at this scale. If you want, you could also take some of that wash and put it into the missile port openings on the shoulder packs, but that's up to you. There's no actual missile tips in there to paint, so I felt like adding a little bit of shadow to those would make it look a little bit more interesting. While the dark tone is drying, grab that soft tone that you had before and go over all of the Bonewhite areas to add some depth and shade them down. Try to get the wash directly on the panel and then work it out to the edges and let the wash creep over the outer edges. This will help add that level of depth. It'll redefine each of those panels so that when you're looking at it from a normal viewing distance, it's going to have a nice contrast between the green and the Bonewhite or whatever accent color that you're using. You can do all these steps at the same time as long as your accent colors have been dried. So that's why we did the wash with the black first. So again, we're maximizing our time to paint these miniatures. While those washes are drying, I've grabbed some khaki and my small dry brush, and I'm just going to finish off the base. Doing a traditional dry brush of taking some regular paint from the bottle, wiping it off on the paper towel as much as possible, and then using light pressure and avoiding the models themselves. I'm going to just use a nice sweeping motion over the raised surfaces of the texture on the base, just to accent and highlight some of those areas to make it look a little bit more realistic. You don't need to spend a lot of time doing this. You can obviously tailor it to your liking, but again, this is something you can do while you're waiting for the actual miniatures to dry, and it's pretty easy to stay away from them using a dry brush as well as going kind of down and vertical here if you can see the angle that I'm using. With the washes dry, if you just touched up the smoke plumes or even added the flame effects like the video that I'll link at the end of this one, then you'll be done with these if you'd like. You could also continue on and add some highlights and details that I'm going to show you how to do now. I'm going to go back and take some of that Bonewhite and add some water to it and thin it down. I want to use something that's not really watery and runny, but I don't want 100% strength thick paint. Using my detail brush, essentially what I'm doing is trying to pull towards the outermost edges of the panels that I'm highlighting and shooting for maybe 1/2 to 1/4 of the panel to get the paint on it. So you can vary that as needed, but they're round surfaces, so it's going to be different for your perspective and what you're trying to accomplish. But essentially, I'm just putting some of this paint on the outer edges to mimic what the light would do, which is reflect more from those areas where they're most exposed and at the angle that they'd be viewed from. If you want to use something a little lighter or a little darker, it's completely up to you for preference. I like to go back to the original color after I've washed it down because it's kind of a safe bet that it's going to look pretty close to the original color and it's not going to go too strong in one direction or the other. And then of course you can tailor it by either adding a second layer or changing the color a little bit by either adding something to lighten it or darken it or whatever your choice may be. But this really will help add some visual variety and some actual light modulation over the accent panel, which are really what your eye is going to see contrasting the green. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to worry about smooth buttery blends or anything like that. If you thinned your paint with a little bit of water and made sure it's not runny and just loaded your brush appropriately, use a paper towel to wick away if it gets too much before you apply it, then you're going to be able to put a little bit of paint on those outer edges and achieve the desired effect. If you prefer to add flow aid or flow improver or things like that to your paints instead of using water, there's nothing wrong with that. Just allow a little extra time for those to dry. And since we accented the Bonewhite, we're going to accent the green. I've gone back and basically remixed the Iosan Green and some of the Ivory together to get a nice light color. In fact, I think I went a little heavier on the Ivory to make sure that it was going to be brighter. And now I'm just using the side of my brush perpendicular to the raised edges and catching the tops and corners and anything that is prominent on the top sides of the elementals. You can do as little or as much of this as you want. You can go a little bit brighter. You could even use white if you wanted to. I would recommend not doing that immediately, just so that you can kind of see what a variation of the base color is going to look like. So if you wanted to add white to the green or whatever color that you're using to highlight with, great, that's fine. And then at the end, if you wanted to go to almost a pure white just to do the very small corners and tips of edges and things, that would be, I think, a much better way to go about doing it, because you avoid the, oh, those look like white dots effect versus, oh, it's a nice gradual buildup from a darker color to a raised edge to a point that's catching the most light. I'm just using a little bit of paint at a time. I'm not worried about trying to be, perfectly detailed in all these areas. I'm just using the side of my brush to do a lot of the work. If the area gets a little bit carried away because your paint is wet, you could use a damp brush that doesn't have any paint on it, and you could wipe it away. You can see I tend to deload the paint on my thumbnail just to make sure that I don't have too much on the brush when I go into some of these harder to reach areas, because I don't want it to just flow away and get too carried away on the model. While you're doing this, you'll probably look back at the ones that you had done before and go, oh, I thought I did those areas. And that's simply because the paint is going to mute down and it's going to be harder to notice it once it's dried. That's completely normal. You can reinforce it by going back after it's dried. I recommend going through all of the models first and then coming back and starting over again to make sure it's dry. And then you can really kind of see how much you want to add, or if you want to adjust the mix of your paint, or if you're happy with it and you're done. It is a fairly involved process. It does add to the time, but I spent maybe another 10 or 15 minutes doing those last little bits of highlights. And once you see how they make the models look, it really, I think, is worth the extra effort. Once they're dried, you can see that I decided to go in, and I'm going to use a little bit of Ivory to add to the corners and edges of just the smallest little areas. Now, it's easy for these to be lost in the details, but because I'm taking photographs of these and showing you how to paint them, and you're going to see them up close, of course I'm going to add a little bit of extra here and there just to make it pop a little bit more. Be pretty conservative with these 100% ivory or white edge highlights. They can really get to be too much sometimes if you're not careful, and if you get a little bit too much paint in one area, quickly wipe it away with your finger or use a damp clean brush that you've got, or a cotton swab even, to smooth it out relatively quickly, so that way it won't dry and you won't have really created yourself something you have to fix, which you'd have to go back with some of the previous colors, and it's a little bit of work. But just keep in mind that if you fix it quickly, it will be much easier to fix. You can also see that I added the wash to my smoke bases in preparation for working on those. And the only thing that differed from the smoke plumes tutorial that is linked at the end of this video is that I added some white and ivory at the very beginning of the jet instead of just starting with a yellow or an orange. It's completely up to you. You could use blues, you could use greens, you could use anything you want to make your plasma jets or exhaust plumes, or you could even leave them without any color and just do smoke color. And here's the finished miniature. I've added black around the base and finished the smoke plumes and some static grass tufts just to kind of make everything tie together and look like a more realistic setting. I hope you found this video useful. Tex, please take us out.
We certainly hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe and leave your questions or comments below. Follow us on Facebook at Battletech Camo Specs Online. Check out our website at camospecs.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Heat critical, shutdown imminent. Time for Pop-Tarts.